Good evening, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining us both here in person and online. Wonderful to see all of you tonight. This evening, we'll be exploring the power and the challenge of dual narratives. If you had two children and something was broken in the house while you were gone and you came home, you understand the importance and the challenge of dual narratives, because each child has a different story about what happened to cause the vase to break. We know this is true in history, we know this is true in political conflict, and this is certainly the case in Israel and in Palestine, in the two dates that are marked in the calendar that seem to run by each other every year. One is Israeli Independence Day, and the other is what the Palestinians call Nakba Day, or Catastrophe Day. We'll be exploring that a bit later in our service tonight. But first, we'll have a chance to explore the power and the challenge of a sense of history, both human history and also, specifically, our Jewish history. And we'll start on page 1 of our service, which I will share for those online or those who prefer to look at a screen instead of a booklet, with a nigun. Remember that the key to a nigun is not what the words mean, but the fact that we are humming or singing together. And so if you feel comfortable, I invite you to join in. Shabbat. This is the end of the week and its beginning. This is the moment of pause, the refilling of the empty vessel, the renewing of the spirit. This is the remembering, the shared memory of 2,000 years and the shared embarking upon 2,000 more. This is the hearth, the gathering together, the pain and the joy, the tears and the gentle laughter. This is the benign wisdom in an old man's eyes and the hope in a boy's fresh voice, the roots into the past and the arms stretched forward into the future. I invite us to pause for a moment of silent reflection, to breathe in and out, to let go of the cares of the week, to enter into that place called Shabbat. Our service continues with the beautiful symbol of the lighting of Shabbat candles. And to light our candles this evening, I'd like to invite our Oneg hosts, Rick and Marcia Bolnick, to come forward as we sing Baruch HaOr. Let us light these lights.
Baruch HaOr, Baruch HaOrat Shabbat, Baruch HaOr Shalom. Shabbat, Baruch Shalom. Let us light these lights and see the way to joy, and let us say Simcha. Let us light these lights and see the way to joy, and let us say Simcha. Let us light these lights and see the way to love, and let us say Ahava. Let us light these lights lights and see the way to love, and let us say Ahava. Let us light these lights and see the way to peace, and let us say Shalom. Let us light these lights and see the way to peace, and let us say Shalom. And let us say Shalom.
There's a history to every glass of wine. Not just the cup in which it sits, which may be an heirloom from ages past, or a glass in a restaurant, or a brand new cup at its first use at a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah, or a wedding. It is also the history of the wine itself, which is only made through history, through the passage of time, and through the patience to take what has been harvested, and then to cultivate it, to press it, and to wait. It takes time to make wine, and it is the feeling we have of time in the wine that makes the ritual of sharing it with each other that much more meaningful. And so this evening I'll sing our Kiddush in Hebrew. If you'd like to join me, please do. And then we can also say the English all together. Baruch haor ba'olam, Baruch haor ba'adam, Borei pri hagafen. Blessed is the light in the world, blessed is the light of humanity that brings forth the fruit of the vine. L'chaim, l'chaim, to life. Good choice. Through the eyes of tradition, through the vision of priests, prophets, and rabbis, Jewish history is a testimony to the power and justice of a loving God. The Jewish people is a chosen people, chosen for special duties and special rewards. All that happens to the Jewish nation is part of a noble divine plan, even though we humans, like poor Job, have difficulty understanding its nobility. But the real history of the Jews has a meaning different from that which the authors of its tradition, the priests, prophets, and rabbis, wanted it to be. No historic belief system can hide the undeserved suffering of the Jewish past. No age-old ideology can hide the cruelty of the fates. In the shadow of the Holocaust, the illusions of the past insult the memories of our martyrs. If Jewish history has any message, it is the demand for human self-reliance. In an indifferent universe, there is no help from destiny. Either we assume responsibility for our fate or no one will. A world without divine guarantees and divine justice is a little bit frightening, but it is also the source of human freedom and human dignity. We stand alone and yet together to create the world we want.
Tikvati bi, efo kochi, kochi bi, vegam bach, efo kochi, kochi bi, vegam bach. Where is my light? My light is in me. Where is my hope? My hope is in me. Where is my strength? My strength is in me. And in you. And in you. Where is my strength? My strength is in me. And in you. And in you.
We are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams, wandering by the lone sea breakers and sitting by desolate streams. World losers and world forsakers on whom the pale moon gleams, yet we are forever movers and shakers of the world forever, it seems. With wonderful deathless ditties, we build up the world's great cities, and out of a fabulous story we fashion an empire's glory. One man with a dream at pleasure shall go forth and conquer a crown, and three with a new song's measure can trample an empire down. We in the ages lying in the buried past of the earth build Nineveh with our sighing, and Babel itself with our mirth, and o'erthrew them with prophesying to the old of the new world's worth. For each age is a dream that is dying, or one that is coming to birth.
הימים חולפים שנה עוברת, הימים חולפים שנה עוברת, אבל המנגינה, אבל המחלה, אבל החבריה תמיד נשארת. Days pass and years go by, ever and ever. Days pass and years go by, ever and ever. And as our voices ring out with songs we sing, life is a joyous thing, ever and ever.
Although many centuries separate us from the events and beliefs of our ancestors, they still speak to our hearts and our minds. Their courage encourages us, their passion inspires ours. We humans are wonderful creatures. Through mind and language, intelligence and memory, we combine all ages within our own, making the past a part of the present. Bits of clay and precious scrolls of parchment reveal glimpses of distant civilizations and transmit wisdom across the centuries. Wisdom is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it, and those who support it are happy. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. In our congregation, we do sometimes read from Torah scrolls or work through a Torah portion of the week, as we've done in many Shabbats since we started the Zoom era. But we also expand our arc. Our arc is wider to include both the wisdom of the first books of the Jewish people and the wisdom of every book we've made since, because we've had new ideas since that Torah was canonized so many centuries ago. And so our choice of Jewish literature for this evening is from the modern canon of Jewish life. It's by an Israeli poet named Yehuda Amichai, whom I've read from many times before. His 99th birthday would have been last week, this past week. And so in honor of that and in honor of the topic of hearing stories from multiple voices, I'd like to share with you a short poem of his entitled, "An Arab Shepherd Seeks a Kid, a Baby Goat, on Mount Zion." And if you think about the stories of the baby goat, there is the goat that runs into the mountains that leads Moses to the burning bush. There is the ram that is caught with its horns in the thickets that becomes the sacrifice in place of Isaac in the binding of Isaac's story. And of course, there is the one baby goat my father bought for 2 zuzim, which is part of a fun song on Passover, but it's not so fun for the goat, if you think about what happens to it in the story. And so, an Arab shepherd seeks a kid on Mount Zion. An Arab shepherd seeks a kid goat on Mount Zion, and on the mountain across I seek my little son. An Arab shepherd and a Jewish father in their temporary failure. Our voices meet above the Sultan's pool in the valley between us. We both want to protect our son and our kid from falling into the process of the terrible machine of Chad Gadya. Later, we found them in the bushes, and our voices returned to us and cried and laughed inside us. The search for a kid or a son was always the beginning of a new religion in these mountains.
Es Chaim hi, Chaim, lamachazikim ba. Es Chaim hi, Chaim, v'tomachei hamushar. Drachei har, darchei noam, v'kol nativoteha, shalom, shalom. Es Chaim hi, Chaim, lamachazikim ba. Es Chaim hi, Chaim, v'tomachei hamushar.
I am a child of wanderers in the desert, herders of sheep, seekers of water. I am a child of slaves, toilers in the baking sun, builders of monuments to the mighty. I am a child of warriors, defenders of their people, cruel victors over others. I am a child of prophets, speakers of truth or power, hard fanatics of a jealous God. I am a child of seekers after truth, scholars of ancient texts, mystics and dreamers. I am a child of farmers and vintners, glassblowers, goldsmiths, bookbinders and tailors. I am a child of poets and singers, laughing and hungering for wisdom and light. I am a child of victims and martyrs. I am a child of those who fought back. I am a child of Hasidim, open to the mystery of the cosmos. I am a child of the Enlightenment, discovering the secrets of the universe. I am a child of the Jewish people, heir to its riches, owner of its treasures.
Yisrael, Yisrael, Ami Yisrael, Am Yisrael chai v'kayam. Yisrael, Yisrael, Ami Yisrael, Am Yisrael chai v'kayam. Am Yisrael chai, Am Yisrael chai, Am Yisrael chai v'kayam. Am Yisrael chai, Am Yisrael chai, Am Yisrael chai v'kayam.
There are those who now look back in complacency and indifference, who accept the fruits of the long journey but ignore the bitter costs of liberation and its lessons in tenacity and endurance. They are the strangers, and the road passes them by. There are others who look back in gratitude and humility, who remember that few present blessings have been won without the sacrifices of the past, who continually reevaluate the spiritual and cultural treasures that the travail of the journey has produced. These are the true heirs of the generations, and for them, the long and agonizing journey has been worthwhile. If you're comfortable standing, could I ask you to please stand for just a moment? In our congregation each month, one of our Shabbat services is dedicated to the recognition of yahrzeits, or anniversaries of deaths that occur in this season. Tonight we also remember, with great love, Jerry Kane, the father of our member Lisa Kane Weaver, who passed away this past month. And we also remember with great love William Adelson, Miriam Sasson-Avon, Jan Block, Pearl Brook, Richard Cohn, Carol Cole, David Davis, Gertrude Edelstein, Ruth Feldman, Edward Fisher, Michael Fisher, Bobby Franks, Nathan Goldberg, Lillian Gordon, Franz Gruenbauer, Gertrude Hart, Tina Hatchwell, Michael Hatchwell, Edward Hollander, Ellen Holmes, Charles Kahn, Maury Kaplan, Ellie Kaplan, Robert Keller, Beverly Klein, Miriam Kopelman, Edith Miller, Cy Passon, Rosalind Podolin, Eugenia Podrobnik, Kowalenko, Barry Rabin, Ethel Rittenberg, Irving Rittenberg, Cecil Rudnick, Carl Sabeth, Mary Scheck, Philip Schulin, Emil Simon, Sidney Smiley, Rose Sohn, Max Sosowitz, Robert Stendel, and Rose Villi Bellotti. Let us pause for a moment of silent tribute in their memory and in memory of all of our loved ones. In Jewish life, we say, Zecher Tzadikim Livracha, the memory of good people is a blessing to us. Please be seated as these words are sung. At this time, I'll play Rhodey for a second. And I'll invite David Hirsch to come forward and let you know of some upcoming events in the congregation.
Shabbat Shalom. There's a lot going on, so know that this is only a smattering, and of course the Wednesday emails and kolhadash.com have the complete calendar. Mazel tov to Asa Levine and his parents Renee and Noah, celebrating a bar mitzvah tomorrow morning here at 10:30 a.m. The congregation is, of course, invited to come celebrate. On Saturday, the 6th, is the Empower Walk to End Domestic Violence. Feel free to join the Kol Hadashers as they go on this. Lynn Miller is here and can answer questions about that. Our Women's Canasta group meets every Monday at Dimitri's at 11:30, playing cards and having lunch. The adult education course that the rabbi leads continues Tuesday nights. On Tuesday the 9th at 7:30 p.m., the rabbi will be talking about Humanistic Judaism, balancing universalism and particularism. And at 7:30, both on Zoom and here. Our Values in Action group is meeting at the Highwood Food Bank at the Fort Sheridan train station, Friday the 12th at 2:45. Tony Biatti is the person, but I bet Lynn can answer those questions if you have questions about that too. Please join us 1 week from tonight and celebrate confirmation. Simon Apley and Jonah Shalom are being confirmed. It is going to be a wonderful service. It's really, I'm obviously biased, but this is not my class. You'll love the service, I promise. A couple quick final things. Our movie club is meeting on the 17th, Wednesday at 7:30. They are discussing a Crossfire and Gentleman's Agreement. On June 1st, our science fiction book club is reading Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. That's Thursday, 7:30, entirely on Zoom. Both of these are on Zoom. And finally, I hope everyone got their invitations to the Kol Hadash Talent Show. Kol Hadash has talent. If you are someone who's in the show, going to be in the show, please remember we're looking for videotapes. If not, we are still looking for some raffle prizes. If you have that old gift card sitting around you don't think you're going to do, or I want to point out that Kol Hadashers are sharing their talents in the raffle as well. So if you think this is a beautiful quilt, Beth Gilbert made this, and a brand new Beth Gilbert creation will be part of the raffle as well. So lots of wonderful things. Get involved. There are lots of ways. We also need some roadies as well. Finally, thanks to the Bolnicks for the Onig tonight, we have a whole list of Onigs for the summer that need hosts. So if you would like to host an Onig or co-host an Onig and one of us, someone else, I'll volunteer, I'll pair with you. It's wonderful and it's not a huge thing and it's very nice to do. So again, everything's in the Wednesday emails, kolhadash.com on the website. If you have questions, talk to whoever afterward. And again, Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, David. Well, to my left and in front of you is our congregational menorah. It's 7 lights, remind us of the 7 days of the week, but also the many aspects of our lives that come together in one community. I'm going to take Rabbi's prerogative and light this first candle. This weekend to next week does mark a transition in our family where one of our students, one of our kids, is graduating as a student from our Sunday school. That's my son Jonah, who will have his confirmation. He may come back as an aide the next year, he may not, but he'll no longer be a student, and I will no longer have a student in the Kol Hadash Sunday School for the first time since we had kids. And that's the second transition. My daughter Maya has grown up at our Sunday school. We have pictures of her at the very first Purim she was at in a little ladybug costume that she was small enough to wear for 2 years in a row, and it worked out great. So she's been a part of this community, and especially on Sunday mornings for quite a long time. She came back as an aide as well after graduating. And she herself is a little sad that this coming Sunday will be her last consecutive Sunday as a participant in our Sunday school youth education program. So this is in honor of transitions. There are things we want to see, but also there's part of us that finds it bittersweet. And so now I'll turn it over to you. If you'd like to light a candle, please step forward and share your reason. Lita, please.
I'm lighting this candle in memory of my husband, who tomorrow marks 22 years since he passed away.
Mm-hmm. Fun. All set.
I'm going to light the candle for my mom's yahrzeit, Edith Miller. She was 85, and she died at this time of the year. And Lynn's uncle Carl, who also died on Mother's Day.
If any of those online would like to light a candle, feel free to unmute yourself, and I'll be happy to light it on your behalf. I see some people moving in the audience as well, so please feel free.
I'm lighting a candle for my brother, who is receiving treatment now for lymphoma, and I pray for his good health.
I'll take care of it. You talk.
Okay.
It's only the oldest technology. You know.
My grandmother, Mary Shack, her yard site was read this evening, and I've been thinking a lot about her actually because my aunt, my father's older sister, she's 90, she is in a nursing home and she is in hospice. She's been in hospice for a while, so I'm not sure that really means anything. But I went to see her last week because we were told that she was possibly nearing the end, and it just made me, I've been thinking a lot about my grandmother because unfortunately you remember seeing people in the nursing home. Like you know, yes, I can remember all of the times that, you know, we went on a trip and she was hilarious and it was funny, but I've just been thinking a lot about her lately. So I'm lighting that in her memory. It's her yard site. But I am the child who made me a mother, which is just bizarre, is 18 years old. He turned 18, and it's just crazy. Noah is 18, and he's off to college. And like you said about transitions, it's wonderful, and he's ready, but it's hard. It's hard. They grow up, that's what they do. It's okay.
I'll take care of it.
Theme tonight. I am lighting a candle for Stevie Silverman Marks, who's battling cancer, breast cancer, and it has spread throughout her body. I knew her in high school, and she and I worked at Ravinia together, and we're sorority sisters, and she brought me into this great choir musical review. We're known as the Red Glove Ladies, and I keep her in my thoughts.
Thank you.
You were done with the wine, weren't you?
Oh, now I am. Stayed in the plate.
I am lighting this for the wine that I just spilled. I'm lighting it for my child who made me a father, who's 38, a little older than yours. Two reasons. One, I'm lighting it for all of the surgeons and doctors in the world. My sister had surgery this morning and is doing just fine. But the other reason I'm lighting it for is
Suspense.
There we go. 2 weeks ago, I was here with the choir, and so I was interacting and talking with those people. And then last week, I was kind of here with the progressive dinner, and we had talked to the people before, at the appetizers, after, at the dessert, and then we had 10 people at our house. Tonight, I'm here, as with Marcia, for the oneg. Next week, I'll be here for the confirmation for Simon and Jonah, because I was a teacher. And so it made me realize in all of those weeks in the different roles that I've had here, how much I like the people at Hadash.
Part of our congregation's creative response to Jewish life is to draw on inspiration from past and present. And so for our special music tonight, Ellen and I have chosen a piece that's new to the congregation. I don't think we've ever heard it or played it here before, but it's a marvelous statement of a humanistic approach to life and also to dealing with conflict and difference in the world. And so here is a new piece for the Kol Hadash repertoire.
To be humble, to be kind, it is a giving of the peace in your mind. To a stranger, to a friend, to give in such a way that has no end. We are love, we are one, we are how we treat each other when the day is done. We are peace, we are war, we are how we treat each other and nothing more. And to be bold, to be brave, it is the thinking that the heart can still be saved. And the darkness can come quick, the danger's in the anger and in the hanging on to it. We are love, we are one, we are how we treat each other when the day is done. We are peace, we are war, we are how we treat each other, nothing more. And tell me what it is that you see, a world that's full of endless possibility. And heroes don't look like they used to, they look like you do. We are love, we are one, we are how we treat each other when the day is done. We are peace, we are war, we are how we treat each other, nothing more. We are how we treat each other, nothing more. We are how we treat each other.
At the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, a new invention was created to treat human suffering, to respond to human trauma, and to try to help. It was something called the talking cure. It was not a medicine or a chemical. It was not something that physically manipulated the body. It was simply to talk. But even more important, it was to listen. The most famous name associated with the talking cure is a man named Sigmund Freud, who grew up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was most associated with the city of Vienna. And Freud actually trained as a medical doctor. He planned to be a neurologist. The problem was, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, there wasn't much we could do to get inside the brain to see how it worked. And so he decided that maybe he could get at what was happening in the brain through the mouth and through the ears. And so he talked to people, and he listened to people, and he took notes, and he speculated, and he investigated, and he created a field we today call psychoanalysis. But more importantly, it was his association with this idea of the talking cure was his lasting contribution. After all, many of his theories about how the brain was structured and the kind of complexes that we have growing up and the traumas we experience, those haven't always borne out through experimental science. We have to recall that Freud's data set was largely affluent people in Vienna. He didn't travel the world to test his theories. He didn't study a cross-section of society, even within his own society. So limited sample size means limited validity, but the talking cure has stuck around because we experienced that hearing the stories was an important step to healing, to feeling a sense of relief, even to becoming happy again, and to moving forward. This is the case even today in most marriage counseling. One of the things that the therapist will ask you to do is repeat back what the other person said. And this is important both to create a line of communication, but also to demonstrate that you're really listening and to help the other person feel like they've really been heard. I find it's a key to my rabbinic work too. The key to a successful funeral eulogy is to listen very carefully to how the family describes their loved one, and then hit rewind and play, and share back to them what they shared with you. And they'll say, it's just like I remembered him, because it is. But the more you listen, the more closely you hear what they have to say, the more they feel heard. And I've had people who come out of the meeting with the family feeling better, more so even than the public funeral. The family sharing is what's really the beginning of the process of healing. Now, every spring in the Middle East, two dates pass each other without really connecting. They run almost parallel lives. Each one is tied to a specific story of a specific people. They are differing national narratives that are intertwined with each other but do not understand each other. One occurs as Israeli Independence Day, every 5th of Iyar. It's tied to the Jewish calendar, but that means it sometimes moves a little bit because if it lands on a Shabbat, you can't light off fireworks. And so they try to adjust it a bit. Sometimes it's a little bit after, a little bit before, to avoid Shabbat, so that the entire Israeli community can celebrate the holiday, or at least the entire Israeli Jewish community can celebrate the holiday. Because the other observance that takes place in a similar season happens on the 15th of May. It's tied to the general calendar, not to the Jewish calendar. And it's marked by both Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and in refugee camps outside of Israeli territorial control, and also by Palestinians of Israeli citizenship to some degree. And they call it Nakba Day, Catastrophe Day. It's tied to the same historical event in 1948. Because in 1948, the 5th of Iyar was the 14th of May. It was the date that the Israeli preliminary government declared independence. And this is why, for the Palestinians, it is a catastrophe day, the very next day. So it's tied to one calendar and to another, but both to the same point in time in 1948 that is read totally differently by the two different communities. Now, I want to share with you both stories of this Independence Day, Nakba Day, of both communities, and listen for where they overlap and where they don't, where the connections and the disconnections, the differing interpretations. And you may have heard most of one and bits of the other, or maybe not all of one or not all of the other, but I want you to try to listen to both, because these are narratives that both peoples tell themselves and tell the world. So here first is the Israeli story. This one may be more familiar to you. The Jewish people, for over 2,000 years, had been forcibly exiled from their homeland, Judea, or the land of Israel. And they had sought to return for generations. Every Passover, you would say, next year in Jerusalem. You would direct your prayers to the eastern wall towards Jerusalem. Some of the most pious would make a pilgrimage at the end of their life so they could die in Jerusalem. At the end of the 19th century, a Zionist movement began, designed to create a Jewish homeland as a political reality, as well as a mass phenomenon of simply thousands and hundreds of thousands, even ultimately millions of Jews returning and ending the exile, canceling the exile, not waiting for a Messiah anymore, no more prayers at the end of the Passover Seder. It's this year in Jerusalem, and I'm going to make it happen. They returned in mass numbers over the course of the early 20th century, and in many cases, they purchased land so they could legally own the territory. They raised money through an organization called the Jewish National Fund. You might have had little boxes on your mantelpiece to collect coins, to buy trees, and to buy land, and even today, the Jewish National Fund owns a substantial proportion of the land in Israel. They purchased the land with a legal title, and when their settlers arrived to create a collective settlement there, we now call it kibbutz or a moshav, often they had to make a fence and a watchtower as the first thing they did when they showed up, because they knew that the natives would raid them or try to drive them off or even try to kill them. They worked the land on these farms, and they also built. They built cities and roads and telegraph wires and telephone wires and industry and an entire self-sufficient society with its own national language of Hebrew. They were able to finally, in the 1920s and later in the 1940s, to receive international declarations from multinational bodies like the League of Nations and the United Nations, ultimately issuing what they called the Partition Plan, declaring that the Jews had an international legal right to a home in this territory. Now, this partition of the land was accepted by the Zionist movement, but not accepted by the other side. Throughout that period of Jewish settlement, the Arabs of that territory were unrelentingly hostile to Jewish settlement, even during the depths of the Holocaust, and there were several pogroms, violent actions that maimed, killed, and destroyed Jewish lives against these Jewish communities and against the British colonial authorities. Ultimately, the tragedy of the 1940s, the Holocaust, demonstrated the need for a Jewish homeland, a refuge for Jews who were suffering. They could not rely on the kindness of other nations. Now, leading up to and even following that Declaration of Independence on the 5th of Iyar, there were mass attacks on Jewish settlements that were where they were supposed to be, and on convoys trying to resupply them, even convoys labeled with the international sign of Red Cross Medical Service. Ultimately, the territory declared by the United Nations as Israel was invaded by several Arab armies, and Israel had to fight on many fronts at once. The brutal fighting included massacres and expulsions on both sides, including Jews having to leave territories that were supposed to be theirs, or at least that they had claimed over the years. And the Israeli government, despite all of its difficulty, made efforts to try to keep Palestinian Arabs in their homes, sending loudspeaker trucks into the streets in Haifa and in Jaffa and in other major cities. The Palestinians, how did they wind up leaving? Well, they were told to clear the way for the Arab armies that would sweep in. So save themselves, get out of the way of the invasion, and come back as a conquering hero. So the Palestinians left voluntarily. They left with nefarious intention, coming back as conquerors, and they expected to return in triumph. And there may have been a couple of cases where Arabs were in fact expelled from their homes by Jews, or occasional massacres that did take place, but even if we can admit those were the case, it was the fog of war. It was a regrettable exception, collateral damage, as they say. And after the end of that war in 1949, which, by the way, was not a full peace treaty, it was simply a ceasefire, the Arab nations were unwilling to make any peace with Israel until the 1970s with Egypt and the 1990s with Jordan. It's still a ceasefire line for Lebanon and Syria. The end result of that was an enlarged Israeli territory from the original partition plan, what today is referred to as the Green Line, or the pre-1967 borders. If you hear those, that means what happened after the war in 1949. And immediately upon the establishment of this territory and the ending of that war, Israel began accepting thousands of Jewish refugees. The large bulk of the Jews of Yemen, almost all of the Jews of Iraq, and of course all those Holocaust survivors languishing in displaced persons camps in Europe with no home to return to. And so the end result of those Arabs fleeing and the Jews coming in was a state that was 80% Jewish and 20% Arab, and those Arabs who stayed became citizens of Israel. They had the right to vote, they had the right to redress in courts, although they were under military law until the 1960s. Nevertheless, ultimately they became full citizens. And what about the Palestinian refugees? In the aftermath of a war, it just wasn't safe to allow all those hostiles to come back into this state of Israel, this nascent state with all these refugees and all of its challenges, and to renew hostilities within the state. This origin story of Israel, as I've told it, is a story of justice for suffering exiles. It's justice for those who were willing to compromise, but who also felt the need to fight for their lives and for their own dignity, to free themselves from a British occupation, and they were enacting that universal principle of national ethnic self-determination. And so it's no wonder, with this narrative in their mind, that Israelis take this date of the 5th of Iyar and make it a celebration, because for them, it's all positive. Now, what's the Palestinian story of the same event? The Arabs had been in Palestine longer than anyone could remember. And most of the Palestinian population worked as farmers, peasants on the land, and it was the land their ancestors had worked and their ancestors before them had worked. They tended to rent it, but it was a rent that went from one generation to the other, and they had always been there. You could even see the brambles and the hedges that they had planted to keep the flocks separate from each other. They were designed to be part of the landscape. If they were in cities, they were shopkeepers and craftsmen, and again, they had been there for generations. In fact, one example of this, if you go to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which, by the way, the trip to Israel I'm running will be doing, if you haven't been there, there's a Muslim family that is trusted with the keys to the church, because the other Christian denominations don't trust each other to have one of them own the key. So it's a Muslim family that's a longtime resident of the old city of Jerusalem that is trusted with the key to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they unlock it first thing in the morning, and they lock it up again at the end of the day. But that's how much a part of the landscape they were. Now, the Arabs of Palestine had always been ruled by the Ottomans, or not always, but certainly for many centuries. And during the Ottoman period, there were plenty of Jews who had lived in Jerusalem and environs and other cities in the territory, in this land of Palestine, and they lived in peace alongside Christian Arabs and the dominant Muslim Arab and Ottoman populations. These Mizrahi Sephardi Jews often spoke Arabic or Turkish, and they were simply part of the landscape. They had their own separate community, which tolerated others and lived more or less in harmony as a second-class citizen, but in a stable position. Now, what changed all this? Beginning in the 19th century, along with European colonies in North Africa, like Algeria, Tunisia, and after World War I, European influences in Lebanon and Syria and Egypt. Well, in the same time period of all these colonies coming in from Europe, thousands of European Jews began to move to the land of Palestine, and it created conflict with the local indigenous population. They were trying to change the culture by importing all these European ideas and cultural norms. Their women wore shorts, as just one example. They not only were taking over the culture, but they were taking over the land physically. They would show up with a piece of paper and tell a family that had worked the farm for generations it was no longer theirs to work, and they had to leave. And not just that they had to leave, but they weren't welcome to work the land anymore, because part of the ideology of these settlers was what they called avodah ivrit, Hebrew labor, meaning we have to work the land and don't hire the non-Jewish population to work on the land. This creates a lot of displaced people, this creates a lot of resentment, this creates a lot of economic dislocation. The Jewish community, the Yishuv, ran its own economy, ran its own cities, published its own newspapers, created its own Hebrew culture. Did they bother to learn Arabic? They learned the word hummus. They borrowed the term falafel. And now when people read about hummus and tabbouleh, they think it's Israeli food. But it was originally Palestinian. Ultimately, the real shame for the Palestinian version of the story is that the Jews are claiming to be the natives of the land, but they worked with the British, and they were coming from Europe. They were the outsiders. They were the colonists who claimed to be native. And the Arabs, they were betrayed by European promises. We sometimes refer to the land of Israel as the thrice promised land, because it was promised to the Jews in the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations Mandate. It was promised to the Arabs under King Faisal and the famous scenes you've seen in Lawrence of Arabia, if you remember that film. And it was also promised to the British and French themselves in the secret Sykes-Picot Treaty that divided the Middle East into spheres of influence. By the way, that's why my last name is spelled with a C, because my father's family in Syria wound up under the French sphere of influence, and so the Shin of Shalom became a CH, like Chateau or Champagne. So I have a small legacy of that European double dealing in my own biography. What about that partition plan? Right? After World War II, there was an attempt to split the land. Well, this was again, from the Palestinian perspective, a betrayal. Because at the time, the Jews represented 1/3 of the population of this historic Palestine territory, and they were promised over 50% of the territory, and a good chunk of the most fertile territory along the coastal plain between Tel Aviv and Haifa. So it didn't seem to be a fair compromise, and it was rejected. What about those Palestinian refugees? If you knew a war was coming to your town, would you stay put? You might flee too. But you might flee with the keys to your house, expecting to come back. And the symbol of the key of the house is one of these Palestinian national symbols. They wear them as necklaces. Even a generation later, it's where they're from and it's where they feel they belong. There were actual incidents of violence by the Israeli armed forces against Arab civilians and forcible expulsions of Palestinians from their villages that were overlooking supply roads or from which attacks had been launched. Well, this created the refugees, and sometimes the attackers weren't from the village, but the village itself paid the price and were expelled at the point of a gun. You can read about this in the memoirs of Yitzhak Rabin or in the wonderful and painful nonfiction book, My Promised Land by the Israeli journalist Ari Shavit, where he talks about the story of Lod, Lida, and what happened to the Jews and the Arabs in their interaction there and the expulsion of Palestinians from that village. And there were certainly excesses by the Israeli armed forces that were propagandized in the Arab press to scare people. The thought was it would scare them to mobilize them to fight. But hearing about the massacre at Deir Yassin and other places simply scared people even more, and more fled. But they expected to return. That's why they carried their keys, and still do to this day. Now, those are two versions of the same event, from very different perspectives. And there is truth in both of those stories, which makes understanding what really happened and what it means today that much harder. Now, these two national groups with different stories are not the only former or present combatants that have different narratives. Think about the North and the South of the United States after the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on who's telling the story. Think about Russia and Ukraine even today, telling different stories about why there's a conflict. And the Palestinian and Israeli conflicting narratives continued after 1948. There were attacks and revenge strikes from and into Gaza and the West Bank between 1949 and 1967. After 1967, there was terrorism and reprisal and occupation and settlement. In trying to settle a conflict, listening to the enemy's story is itself a revolutionary act, one that will get you accused of treason or self-hatred. There's an organization that's very brave. It's called the Bereaved Families Forum. These are people who have lost loved ones in the conflict, but who feel the need to listen to each other. And so they're Arab Palestinians, they're Arab Israelis, they're Jewish Israelis. They come together and share their stories of how their loved one died, what they feel about the conflict, and they listen to each other. Again, it's not just the telling, it's the listening. In recent years, this organization has sponsored a joint Memorial Day observance. On Israeli Memorial Day, they memorialize all the lives lost in the conflict, both sides. It's hard to do. This last year, there were 15,000 people who participated live in Israel and thousands more who watched it online. But you can imagine some people hearing of this event called them traitors, called them self-hating Jews, the enemy. There was not openness to listening. Why is it that we refuse to hear? Why do we not acknowledge the story of the other side? Well, we know that our own story justifies ourselves. And we don't trust the other person to tell the story truthfully. We think they're lying, they're making it up, it couldn't have been that way. There is a fear sometimes of legal consequences if we accept their story. Does that mean we accept the guilt and the blame? Are there moral consequences if we accept the truth of what they say, well, what does that mean for what we've done in the interim? Certainly, when you hate the other, when you have anger at the other, it means they must be all bad and we must be all good. And never concede. Don't give in. And perhaps the hardest is the challenge of changing our own self-conception. You may have noticed a little bit of tumult in America lately over this initiative called the 1619 Project, which was an attempt to reframe understanding America through the lens of slavery and oppression, through black eyes instead of through white colonist eyes in Plymouth Rock. This is a different way to understand America, and for many it's very upsetting to have to think about life this way, and you can see the reaction in curriculum debates and what books are allowed in classrooms and on and on. It's continuing even today, and will continue for a long time, because the question is, can we accept an America that isn't schoolhouse rock and nice and neat and happy and manifest destiny and everything's wonderful? Liberty, freedom, happiness, the pursuit of happiness, right? That's what we're all about. All men are created equal, right? Written by people who own slaves. At the very beginning of Howard Zinn's excellent history, A People's History of the United States, he says very candidly, this book has an agenda. And here is my agenda. I want to focus on these people. I want to highlight these issues. And he says, anytime you draw a map, anytime you take a picture, you're defining your scope, your boundaries, the details, what you choose to include and what you don't. Every historian, every story does that. It has an agenda, it has a message. But if you want to discover the truth, you have to listen to more than one story. If you want to know what's happening in the world today, you have to read more than one news website for more than one perspective. Now, sometimes the more perspectives you get, the more you get close to some kind of reality. You know, think about the proverbial blind men and the elephant, where they're feeling around, and one sees a trunk, and one sees a tail, and one sees a leg, and they imagine it's a very different animal. But if you get enough people and enough hands sharing enough information, and to be said, a patient enough elephant to let all those people do that, you might get a full picture of the elephant. There's an irony when it comes to making maps of this territory. What's included and what's left out? Where do you draw the lines? You often see Palestinians getting condemned for drawing a map that erases Israel. It doesn't show Israel on the map, it's just from the river to the sea, one territory. But now you have members of the Israeli right who draw a map with no lines, because from their point of view, it's erasing Palestine, and it's only ours, not theirs. And the sad reality that these claims from opposite perspectives presents to us is something I've said from Kol Hadash's pulpit before. It's a sad reality that the two-state solution that was part of the proposed partition plans going back to the 1930s, and certainly the United Nations plan of the 1940s, those partition plans, even into Oslo, they're probably dead. The hard reality is that what needs to happen now is to work to make the best possible Israelistine, or Palliel, or whatever you want to put it together, the best possible one state that can be. It may be a binational state with two stories and two anthems and two flags. We don't know. But the separation of the two seems to be almost impossible. And the first step to getting past the anger, the conflict, and the past is to hear the stories of the other side, to understand them, to be able to say them back, and ultimately to find a way to integrate them into our own narrative. If we are together to move beyond the trauma to coexistence, the first step will be to listen. Again, I want to thank you for coming this evening, thank our Onek host, the Volniks, and thank our musicians as well for their wonderful accompaniment. Our closing song is on the last page of your service. Appropriately, it is Hoping for Brothers and Sisters, for people to dwell together. It is called Hine Matov, and I invite us all to join and sing together.
שבת אחים גם יחד, הנה מה טוב ומה נעים. שבת אחים גם יחד, הנה מה טוב ומה נעים. לה 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 לה, הנה מה טוב ומה נעים. לה 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 לה, הנה מה טוב ומה נעים. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים. לה 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 לה, הנה מה טוב ומה נעים. שבת אחים גם יחד, הנה מה טוב ומה נעים. שבת אחים גם יחד.
Once again, I want to wish you a Shabbat Shalom. I invite you to wish Shabbat Shalom to the people near you.